listener production.
Ned Kelly's legacy is one of the most iconic and divisive in Australian history. But long after his execution, one mystery lingered. What happened to his remains? From a chaotic 1929 exhumation in a Melbourne prison graveyard to the 2009 use of mitochondrial DNA and CT scanning, forensic experts faced immense challenges: ethical, historical, and scientific. In this episode, we hear from Professor David Ranson, who led the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine team that spent nearly 2 years untangling fact from folklore. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
I think you've got to think of Ned in different perspectives. So you have this concept, as far as, the police force is concerned, he was a police killer. So there's that sort of side. There's also the side of his background, the sort of the Irish community in rural Victoria, dealing in horses. Clearly it was a character at the sort of fringes of some aspects of those society, but deeply embedded in other societies. And so he's quite an enigmatic character in a way because of that. And he's so many different things to different people, including residual family members, of course, who are linked to that family and to, are still around today. And so you do get this very polarizing sort of views on him. In other sectors, he's seen as almost as a freedom fighter, someone who is, in fact, a subject of great miscarriage of justice in that formal legal sense. So a very complex character at the end of the day.
Now, he was executed in 1880 and his body was, minus its head, was put into a wooden box and thrown into a mass grave along with the bodies of other prisoners at the old Melbourne jail. But how did his remains come into your professional world?
It's quite a complicated situation because in those days, prisoners who were executed, their bodies stayed and were buried in the prison. They were not given back to the families. It was almost as if, the families are being punished as well. And that's very much that sort of ethos of the time, and indeed earlier times. We think of, being hung, drawn and quartered, those sorts of things. This concept that you do more to damage the body after death because that also sends strong social messages. So he was buried in the old Melbourne jail and so on. In fact, there are markings on some of the blue stones of where people were buried, but it was all very ad hoc and there didn't seem to be a lot of precision about that. And then with the move of the prison to essentially to Pentridge, then the old Melbourne jail was reorganised. I think it was going to be part of Mechanics Institute and that sort of thing early on, and then eventually obviously became a National Trust sort of property and so on. But what was really going on was when they realised they had to move the prison, they said, well, what do we do with the bodies? Because there are all these bodies buried there. And I think as they started to do that sort of work, the bodies suddenly became uncovered. And in fact, my understanding was there was a whole heap of people, the students from the local mechanics group and so on, all came down and they sort of scavenged the site. And it was a bit of an outrage. I mean, I think it was mentioned in Parliament, how appalling this was, that people were walking off with bits of bone and holding skulls and all this sort of stuff. And eventually, money was found. No, this needs to be done properly. We will exhume all the remains we can find and we will move them to Pentridge. And that was done. But of course, in the course of that, this wasn't done with any sort of real archaeological precision. So the delineation of those individual bodies and remains and so on wasn't necessarily done, and in fact the records aren't that great around that. What we did have was an area at Pentridge where, of course, all these bodies had been placed. Then, of course, in the modern era, they decided to close Pentridge. But of course, then the question was, what do we do with the graves again? And this time there was more interest in doing it in a more precise way and getting proper archaeological approaches to it. And then people said, well, where is Ned? For a whole variety of reasons, that sort of punitive thing of not giving them bodies back to the family was now outmoded. And there were detailed conversations with family about what should happen, and indeed trying to find family who would take the deceased and look at appropriate burial and so on. Again, a controversial and difficult thing to do because, of course, there remains a cultural interest in Ned Kelly and therefore an interest in getting exposed to and seeing and be able to visit his grave and things like that. Now, whether that's genuinely something that should be happening, should we deal with this as a family matter or should we deal with this as a cultural icon issue, particularly when he's a very controversial icon in that particular context. So there were some really difficult decisions around that, plus the fact we actually didn't have identification of his body anyway.
So he was just one skeleton in a whole
that's
mass.
Right. And then there was this other parallel story, which is fascinating, which was, of course, the skull of Ned Kelly, or the alleged skull of Ned Kelly, was on display in the old Melbourne Journal, had been for ages and ages and ages, until it mysteriously disappeared. And there was a particular person who identified themselves saying, well, I took it because it's totally disrespectful to have his skull and things like that and display and so on. And the skull disappeared. And disappeared for quite some time. And a little later on, when this person was coming towards the end of their life, they wanted to return it, and as long as it was treated in a respectful way. That's sort of part of the story. At the same time, we had, a person who I think had been the mayor of South Melbourne, who apparently had a tooth from that skull and is seen holding the skull. And then there's a whole story even before this issue of the skull and so on, which related to what happened to Ned's body after his execution. And that's a little bit that I did get involved with, and we were able to identify the remains. And there was issues around, being dealt with by the Anatomical Institute and things like that. And there were stories of it being used as a paperweight and so on. But most of these were sort of very apocryphal. And, I don't want to go back to, Liz, your journalist days, but there's some wonderful pieces of journalism around where I think they're blending emotion and fiction and reality in a sort of culturally interesting way, but meant that you couldn't necessarily rely on them terribly much for perhaps what really happened. I mean, clearly there were examinations of bodies after executions, and there's no question those sorts of things occurred.
Do we know how his skull or how his head became separated from his body, for example?
I don't think we do know the answer to that, no. And in fact, that's part of the issue, that this skull that was found is almost certainly not Ned's skull, and that we were able to demonstrate that for a whole variety of reasons. But one of the things that we did eventually realise was that when we did identify his skeleton, and it was identified in a variety of ways, I actually removed some of the police bullets from his bones, actually.
So when the bodies were exhumed in 2009, how was the decision made? Who made it and what happened? Because in 2009, you had a graveyard full of skeletons, one of which you thought would be Ned Kelly's.
I think the full details of that I don't know in great detail, but obviously the Victorian government was also involved. They wanted these remains to be dealt with respectfully. They wanted clarity about what the remains are. The coroner's legislation permitted levels of investigation although there are cut-off periods in relation to what cases a coroner can actually deal with. And as long as you could identify this was one of those cases of that age and antiquity, then the coroner wouldn't be taking an active role in it. But that doesn't mean that the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine couldn't assist in, I think, the decency of let's find out and let's work with the family. Let's see how we can return the body to the family and be sure that what we're doing is right and meets those expectations. At the same time, there is a strong historical narrative that I think people wanted answers to. And, as a forensic medical organisation where we do examine individuals, then we could set the record straight. A lot of forensic pathology is actually about setting the historical record straight. What did happen, what didn't happen, what can we say about things? That's a critical function of what we do, for example, in armed conflict cases and human rights abuse cases. It's about setting the record straight. And so this was of a very different nature, but we were setting the record straight. And so in identifying it, yes, there was a strong DNA element to that, no question about that. But we were also, for example, able to look at the history, the medical records. Where were the injuries that they'd suffered? Where are those injuries on his bones? And so we were able to find the damage, the infected wounds that had difficulty healing from the police bullets, and we found those changes in the bones.
With the chaos of the original, the first move from one graveyard to another, were all the bones commingled? Did you have to do a lot of sorting?
Commingling. There was some sorting, but essentially my understanding is that most of these were in some sort of clustering. And so there was a cluster that we identified fairly on that might be significant for being Ned, and that related again to those issues around the injuries to the bones, where we knew he had been shot, where we knew there had been an infected wound. In fact, he had effectively an osteomyelitis, an infection of bone. And we could see those features on, and we had a pretty good idea that was those remains. And then we were trying to work back through family and linked issues with, mitochondrial DNA to track back to see if those bones did link like that, which they did. And then the issue of the skull came up because, in fact, we did find a small portion of skull, but nothing like the whole skull, just a small bit. It was exactly the sort of bit that you might expect a pathologist doing an autopsy on a recently executed prisoner to have worked on, because it was right at the back of the head, right near where the vertebrae connect to the base of the skull, and exactly in those areas where you can get damage associated with judicial hanging. So clearly there had been some dissection in that area as part of that post-mortem activity. So we were able to put all that together and say, yes, actually, we can actually see the saw cuts that would have been made in order to explore the upper neck and the spinal cord in that area. I could see the saw cuts on the back of the skull and the small piece of skull bone that we had, and also saw cuts in the vertebrae in that area. So you were able to use those sort of pathological skills, if you like, and understanding of what would be required to explore that area of the body. And, that was a very, you being able to use those sort of technical skills enabled you to actually open up and give some more information about what might have happened to Ned after death. I mean, one of the really interesting things is people sometimes sort of say, well, why do you get involved in historical case? Why are we wasting money? I mean, I don't believe it's a waste at all. And indeed, the Attorney General at the time was very, very keen on this sort of historical work taking place, as well as the fact that we were able to bring a team together who, obviously we work together every day in a general sense. But now this was a focused piece of work on really tricky identification and exploration issues. Those are exactly the skill sets and the teamwork that you need when you're dealing with complex homicides. It's exactly the same skill sets you need when you're dealing with an aircraft crash or a major bus crash or a major train crash. anything you can do to bring teams together so they can work on a case encourages and supports that overall investigation of what you need to do, tragically, sometimes in your real modern job. And I think that was a really powerful way in which we were able to say everything we are doing when we're exploring the issues of these graves and the prisons and Ned Kelly is directly relatable to the job we do every day when we get into complex deaths and we get into complex human identification issues.
You mentioned, David, that you did mitochondrial DNA analysis on Ned's bones. Can you explain that?
When we think about DNA, we tend to think about the nucleus of the cell, and we talk about nuclear DNA, and that's the DNA that is most commonly used in issues of identification in ordinary criminal casework. However, there are other parts of the cell, the human cell, that have DNA in it, and one type of DNA is a small DNA ring that's actually contained within the mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are the little powerhouses in the cell, if you like. They actually help the cell generate energy, and they actually have a tiny little fragment of DNA in them. Now, the interesting thing is that they're inherited from the general cytoplasm. They're not part of the nucleus, and we inherit our cytoplasm and our first lot of mitochondria, in fact, from our mother. So mitochondrial DNA is always inherited from the mother. It's nothing like as specific as nuclear DNA, but obviously if the mitochondrial DNA does not match, then you can sort of say, well, it's not related to that person's mother. And you could go down the maternal line and you can see that inherited DNA extending down the maternal line. Now, mitochondrial DNA there's much more of it in a strange way because we've got loads of mitochondria in the cells, and it tends to therefore be at a higher sort of quantum, so that we can often get mitochondrial DNA out of very, very poor quality specimens than the nuclear DNA. So nuclear DNA can be lost for a whole variety of reasons, broken down and so on, whereas we might find some traces of mitochondrial DNA still there. Now, it's not as precise. It's not a one-to-one, yes, we've got this DNA, it matches this, so we know it's this person. It doesn't work quite like that with mitochondrial DNA, but obviously if you can show that link to the maternal line, it's powerful evidence. But of course, this is where the historians come in. The historians are going back and saying, well, who is Ned Kelly's mother? Ned Kelly doesn't pass his mitochondrial DNA on to anybody, but the mother passes it on to all the children, and therefore where is the maternal line which would have had the same mitochondrial DNA as Ned Kelly? And that's where the historians have to work their way back through quite complex history, of course. It's fortunate in the sense that we tend to know who our mother is, but we can't be quite sure who our father is. And so in a sense, that comes quite useful from a mitochondrial DNA perspective.
And you had one descendant on whom you did a DNA examination?
Yep. So there were DNA examinations done in order to try and get that sort of confirmation. That's right, yes.
And that was somebody called Lee Oliver?
Yeah, the Lee Oliver saga is a complex saga in terms of getting those identifications and things like that.
Lee Oliver was a great-grandson of Ned Kelly's sister Ellen. So his mitochondrial DNA was a match for Ned's.
That's right. And so what you've got is this pathway back. As I said, it's a maternal inherited line. So Ned's mum, all of Ned's siblings inherited mum's mitochondrial DNA, so the sister would have had it. That would have passed down a maternal line. So you need to show, it doesn't matter whether you're testing a male at the end of the line, but you need to show that there's a maternal linkage all the way up in order to be sure.
And you were sure in the end? Was there any room for doubt?
I think when we're talking about any forensic test, what you're always doing is using multiple parallel lines of investigation in order to confirm these things. So we have the mitochondrial DNA confirmation line. We've also got the anthropology line to say, well, is these remains the remains of a person of that age and height and all those sorts of things. You've got all that work. You've got the pathology disease work saying, well, we know historically there's gunshot wounds here, here and here, and they've all been documented, and sure enough, the skeleton does have that, and the projectiles that I recovered from the bone are the ones that were used by the police at that time. And then you go on to say, what about the disease state? There's a poorly healing wound here. Are there changes in the bone that reflect a poorly healing wound? And is it in the right place? And they were. So what we had at the end of the day is multiple lines of investigation all coming together to demonstrate that. As forensic people, we don't like relying on one single piece of evidence. We like to have multiple pieces of evidence that come together that are internally consistent.
So at the same time as the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine's DNA team was doing DNA analysis on the bones of this body, what was happening with the skull?
Yes, because the skull had been returned. So we wanted to know clearly is this Ned Kelly's skull or not? And so there were a number of ways in which that was sort of looked at. And it was interesting because you can look at the skull from a number of perspectives. Once we had clearly identified which was Ned's skeleton from the Pentridge prison graves, and we knew there was a portion of bone that from the skull there, clearly that portion of bone was not missing from the skull return. So we had a very strong line right up front from a sort of anthropological point of view that this was not Ned's skull. But we obviously wanted to explore a whole range of technologies to look at that, because we didn't actually know that until a bit later on. So right up front at the beginning, we were looking at, can we get DNA out of this skull and can we compare it and things like that? There was a tooth that somebody held and that was allegedly come from that skull, and sure enough, it did fit. But again, they didn't tell us who it was in any shape or form. But what we did have, which was really interesting, was that when people died or were executed, traditionally they made death masks. So if you think of sort of Madame Tussauds and things like that, they would make a plaster cast of a death mask. And so that would involve literally having the dead person essentially sort of sitting up with their head sticking through a board with a hole in it sort of thing, and literally having, a plaster Paris, a mould made of their head. And this was quite commonly done. Indeed, there was a whole issue around, the phrenology, the bumps on people's heads proving criminal incapacity and inclinations and things like that, and a whole variety of pseudoscience around bumps on the head and personality was very much a trend at that time. So there was a real interest in saying, well, what can we learn about these people who did terrible, evil things? Let's explore their heads, and we're interested in the bumps and things, and they made these moulds. And of course, from those moulds, they could cast more moulds and so on. Of course, the original first negative mould, if you like, often went away with things like bits of eyelash and bits of eyebrow hair and things like that, and perhaps a bit of beard and so on. Of course, a lot of those tissues would have had DNA. So finding some of those moulds would have been quite interesting. But what we did probably more so than that was we CT scan. Now, Victorian Forensic Medicine is very lucky in that we were one of the first places around to get CT scanners involved in regular autopsy work. In fact, we've pretty well CT scanned everybody brought into the building since about 2005 and so on. So we were able to not only CT scan this particular skull, but we were able to CT scan effectively a whole range of these head moulds, these death masks that had been made. And what we were able to do then, of course, was to actually see, well, does the skull actually fit in to the mould? Now, obviously, you can fit, a range of skulls inside particular moulds. It's not going to be an identifying feature per se, but it could exclude a few people, which it did. And then we were left with a couple of possibilities of what might be there. And by that time, I think we'd pretty well worked out it wasn't Ned's, but the question is, whose was it? And that was a really interesting time because we were exploring a range of possibilities. And at one stage, I was visiting the UK for something totally different. And we did arrange to exhume somebody who we thought might be a brother of a person whose skull it could be. So we're going to try and get a DNA sample, which we did. It turned out not to be that person. But I spent a very interesting and very cold night in a cemetery just outside Liverpool doing an exhumation.
Was that related to the theory that the skull might belong to Frederick Deeming, who was one of the suspects for the infamous Jack the Ripper murder?
Yes. I mean, that was one of the really fascinating bits of exploration here. And it was actually quite a delicate thing to have to do, actually, because you can't just go into a graveyard and take samples from somebody. And it had to have more than just a scientific and sort of vicarious interest about it. The Anglican Church in England, it takes a great deal of sort of serious contemplation of issues about sampling. And what we had here was a potential that this skull belonged to Frederick Deeming. And we weren't really, I have to say, terribly concerned about the Jack the Ripper issue, and I think there's very poor evidence in that space. But the reality was that Frederick Deeming's brother was buried, and there were relatives there. They sort of were interested to know, is our cousin, whatever, a relative, have a skull which is not tied to a body and to a grave. What do we do? And they were very supportive of the notion of getting an identity if we could. Frederick Deeming had been a very interesting character. He'd sort of gone from the UK, where he had probably killed family there. He'd gone to a few other countries on his way through to Australia, when he killed family in Australia, for which he was eventually executed in Melbourne. So he was a very interesting character. He had a fairly rich and fictional sort of life and settings, where he called himself some baron or count or something like that, and he sort of quite a sort of ultimate type sort of character, I suspect, with lots of ideas and grandiose things. But he, there's good evidence he killed significant family members and people he married and so on. So really quite a interesting and challenging person. So we eventually had to make a moral argument, and again, our legal team at the Institute did a lot of this work. Fiona Lay and her team did an enormous amount of work in meeting not just the scientific basis and the historical basis, but the moral basis and the ethical basis of actually proceeding to exhuming in order to get a DNA sample.
And there is quite a bureaucratic process involved in gaining permission to exhume a body, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. And in this case, it wasn't just ordinary courts and permissions. We had to have sort of government and administrative permissions, but we actually required the ecclesiastical court permission, because this was a cemetery controlled by the church. And that's why the arguments had to be not just scientific, but they had to have a moral and ethical dimension. And I think we were very fortunate to be able to meet those standards, and that, it goes to the credit of the legal team who did a lot of that work. As I said, we were able to obtain samples. In the end of the day, the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, did not match, but there was a strong basis of saying, well, it's going to be one of these people, and this person is someone we could trail through, and it was a reasonable prospect. So we haven't obviously identified all those remains in that broad sense, but we were at least able to say that skull that was on display for so many years at the Old Melbourne Jail was certainly not Ned Kelly.
And do we know where that skull is now?
Well, all of the remains have been respectfully dealt with. And that's a really important aspect of the closure of the matter. Those details are all held. Obviously, there's certain sensitivities about some of those graves and so on. And that's, been dealt with.
Do you have any personal theory on where Ned Kelly's actual skull might be?
I don't specifically. I mean, there must be lots and lots of possibilities, including that it was used in some sort of, teaching process and worked its way around various institutions, we said the Institute of Anatomy and all that sort of thing. There are links that are potentially there, but there would have been, many, many people who had the capacity to handle that skull at some stage, and whether, it was moved off for some other purpose. Look, it's entirely feasible. There wasn't that same sense of awe and respect for the nature of human tissues in the same way in those days. So, those executed prisoners, the autopsies might be attended to, the bodies might go off to the university, the medical students would dissect them with supervisors, and all of that process was actually actively permitted. And it took some time for those processes to be reined back so that we have the sort of much, much more constrained and controlled systems we have today for the handling of human tissue, which is incredibly detailed and hard to meet all the requirements, as it should be. But that wasn't the situation then. I remember actually, I think I was on Red Simon's breakfast program on the ABC, where somebody had sort of come up and saying, I've got this skull. They sent the pictures through and it was sort of a painted skull. And I was able to look at it and say, well, I know what needs to be there for it to be Ned, and it cannot possibly be Ned. So, it's sort of really interesting that you get these sort of lots of people wanted to come out of the woodwork saying, oh, I've got this and I'm sure it's this. And I've lived with that on lots of occasions in my career where people are convinced they have the answer. The fact that the answer isn't obvious and straightforward right up front tells you something about the likelihood of these rare things actually being true.
Every time there's a news story about Ned Kelly or some issue, the historians are fascinated, the journalists are interested. Often police are very critical.
Yes, and this goes to that issue I was commenting on at the beginning. To many, he was a police killer, and in that sense, I mean, as a matter of fact, that record shows that's true. So, from a particular perspective of that sector, on that group of people, there is a reluctance to give hero status to someone who killed people and killed police officers. Now, the context in which that killing occurred is certainly the accounts of what happened at the time are still subject to different interpretations. What happened at the trial, how fair that was in the context of those alternate explanations, again, has been the source of lots of commentary and even plays written about it and things like that. So that, you do have to balance in any sort of investigation like this that there will be strong competing interests in relation to that more emotional content. And from a forensic point of view, I suppose we try, wherever possible, not to be part of that sort of, I'm not going to say partisan, but I don't mean it in a negative sense, a viewpoint of what's going on. We try to be much more strictly applying the science to what we can say and say, well, this supports this account at the time and this doesn't support this account at the time. And all we can do is lay that out. We have no further engagement with it. I think there's a police view like that, which I completely accept. And, there's strong truth in a lot of that. There's also, what was going on sociologically at the time for that immigrant community in that part of rural Victoria? What did they face in the way of administrative oversight, police actions, prejudice? All of those sorts of things were clearly going on, and they form part of the sociology of what goes on. And you can argue that almost all crime is linked back to a sociology as well as to an individuality, and understanding both and apportioning the weight, different weights to those, I think is really important when you try to understand why do we have the crimes we have. Just from my days as a forensic pathologist, the vast majority of homicide cases I would have dealt with would have been effectively domestic, family-related situations, whether between intimate partners. That's the vast majority. And now we're looking at family violence and those issues with far more of a magnifying lens than we did 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, we recognised it, but now those lenses have changed. And we're seeing that in both the individual and the social contents of that, and how society addresses those things as being more and more important, and rightly so.
But you were never criticised by police or other sources for spending all this time and money on this investigation?
I don't think we were, no. I mean, I think people will sort of say, well, from a purely policing perspective, why spend so much time dealing with a criminal? I mean, in that sense, sure, there would have been those sort of views, I'm sure. But as I was saying, the really important thing here is that we were able to bring together so many of our techniques and work in an integrated team-like way, which we don't always have the opportunity to do until there's a bombing, until a plane goes down. That's when all those things happen. So being able to do that and test out and check and improve a lot of our skill sets on a really difficult to solve case is a wonderful internal exercise. And certainly as an institute, we recognise the social importance of what was being done, but we actually prioritised the fact that we were able to enhance some of our analytical techniques by engaging in this sort of work.
So it was a valuable historical exercise, of course, but also an invaluable training exercise.
Absolutely.
For you.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So thanks again, David, for coming in. It was really interesting.
Delightful. It was a fascinating case to talk about.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Dan Mullins and Jade Murray. Sound design is by Link Kelly.